Good afternoon and welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolene Whitney. Deep in the dog days of August, it's difficult to recall the icy cool of a morning in March. But summertime is the right time to learn how maple production sugared off. Summer is when the final tallies are reported by the USDA NASS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service, which calculates how much maple was made during the year. All in all, 2024 was a good year for Vermont sugar makers, and today we go inside the numbers to learn just how sweet this year was for sugar makers. To talk about the maple production this year and what trends are happening in the maple industry, I'm joined by UVM Extension maple specialist Mark Isselhardt. Long time no see. I heard when you weren't bringing in maple syrup, I said, don't let him in, but I'm glad we get to talk statistics instead.
Happy to be here.
How's your summer been so far?
It's been well, thank you.
All right, great. And so let's jump into it. Let's start with the NASS. I just mentioned that collects data, and it's not just on maple syrup, it's on all agricultural production in the United States. Can you tell me how that's done?
Sure. So NASS collects data on 130 different crops nationwide, everything from corn and soybeans to lots of other products, including maple syrup. And every year, a voluntary survey gets sent out to known maple producers. And it's a survey where they have to answer questions about production, lots of different statistics. That gets compiled and then published in mid-June. And that is really the best data we have to see how the production happened. There's lots of conversations between sugar makers, of course, but year after year, this is the most reliable data set. Every 5 years, they also publish what's called the Census of Ag, which is an even more detailed look at agricultural production in maple.
And you mentioned just barely, it's a voluntary survey that's sent out. Is there at all a concern of underreporting when we look at this data?
Absolutely. And I would say the most powerful strength of this data is showing trends. In absolute numbers, we know for a fact that it is underreporting. We think in Vermont we might be underreporting by 35 or 40%, which is a huge amount. Other states, it could be even more than that. And it's a function of NASS not knowing producers exist, changes in the industry, growth happening, and it just takes a while for them to catch up with developments. With those flaws or deficits, it's still the best data we have to work with, and it's really the way we can talk about the strength of the maple production.
All right, and let's jump into some of those numbers. How many gallons of maple syrup did sugar makers in Vermont make this year?
So according to the NASS numbers, 2024, Vermont produced about 1.3 million gallons of syrup, and that's over 50% of all the syrup reported in the US. So again, a huge crop. We have over 8 million taps in Vermont, also tops in the state. The production came, like it always does, in February and March, typically, although some of the larger operations were reporting producing syrup as early as January. The yield per tap is also quite high, so Vermont sugar makers are able to produce a little over a third of a gallon of syrup per tap, which is close to the best yield of syrup per tap in the country.
And what's the difference between yield and the gallons themselves?
Yeah, so yield is really just taking total gallons divided by total taps. So it's a function of how much adoption of technology, how good producers are at utilizing leak checking and maintaining their system. Typically, producers who invest a lot in labor and efficiency and technology are going to see a higher yield per tap versus ones who are really at the whim of Mother Nature, maybe using a gravity sap collection, using buckets. They will typically see a lower yield per tap.
And there's a new statistic, the acreage statistic, which is important to forestry. And what's the significance of that data for maple syrup?
Right. Well, it's encouraging that NASS is starting to report this data because maple is this unique thing. It's an amalgam of agriculture and forestry, and this is really the first time we'll have data on how many acres of sugar bush are being tapped. So not unlike the production, Vermont leads the country in number of acres. So 141,000 acres in Vermont are being tapped for maple production. It's by far the most in the country, and yet we know that there's still more tappable acres in the state. You can also use that acreage number to look at the production per acre. So instead of the per tap yield, you can look at production per acre, which could be a reflection of what kind of careful forestry is being done, how healthy those trees are, what the density of tappable trees are. So without knowing that acreage number, it's hard to look at these other metrics as far as comparing how are Vermont sugar bushes doing?
Yeah, it sounds like it provides information on a lot of other components of sugaring.
Absolutely.
And so now that we know the numbers from this year, can you tell me how they compare to years past?
Right. So with all the technology, all the innovation that sugar makers are known for, Mother Nature still has the biggest role in whether or not sugar makers are able to harvest a successful amount of sap and produce it into syrup. So 2024 was considered largely a good year. 2023 failed to meet the target for a lot of producers, and it really came down to temperature. People who had generally colder sugar bushes just never really saw those big flows that they were hoping for, whereas folks with warmer bushes, again, Champlain Valley, southerly facing warm sugar bushes, they did pretty well, and they were generally happy. Overall, there tends to be larger production in areas where it's generally colder or more northerly, and so the overall production, if you have an overly warm season, overall we'll see the crop be a little bit smaller in Vermont.
And how is that information collected, the temperature information? Who collects it?
Right, that's a little bit informal. I do something called the Vermont Maple Bulletin. It's a during the season update on how the season's progressing, and I work directly with producers around the state to send out a survey with the same questions. They respond back, including reporting generally what kind of sugar bush do they have. Are they generally warm or generally cold or average? And then I can compile that at the end of the season and give summary. So that's one of the ways we can do it.
And you said it's pretty easy to compare numbers this year to numbers last year, but it's a lot better to look at the trend. Is that right?
Sure. So for example, 2024 production was up 10% over the 5-year average. But if you look at that average, there was a lot of volatility. So going back to 2022, it was really the largest amount of production we've seen in Vermont in 100 years. A lot of folks may not remember, but we produced a lot more syrup 100 years ago than we do now. It was just broadly distributed across lots of very small farms. Fast forward 100 years, now we're really focused on smaller but larger operations. So 2022 had a great weather for basically all types of operations. 2021, it was too warm. 2023 was too cold for a lot of folks. So it bounces around, even with all the technology that folks are employing to harvest sap.
And you've worked with people across the country to improve data collection methods, is that right?
Right. So myself and another sugar maker, Dave Foligno, in Vermont, have head up a working group through the International Maple Syrup Institute. This is an industry group. We've engaged directly with USDA to improve that survey. Largely, it's shortening it. So taking it from 4 pages to 2, really focusing on what the industry wants to know, what's the most important measures for the strength and trends in the industry. We were lucky enough to have Mark Isselhardt, who's with UVM Extension, be on that working group, as well as producers from around the country. And USDA was really supportive of that. And so we're now 2 years into that new survey. It's really important that people fill it out. By law, they can't share any of that production information with other federal agencies. So it's really just to give a good view of where the industry is. And that's going to draw more investment. It's going to draw more folks doing research. And so we really want to have the most accurate numbers possible.
And Vermont isn't the only state that's making maple syrup, and places like Michigan and Wisconsin are kind of on the up and up of production. Is that something that Vermont sugar makers should be concerned about?
I wouldn't say concerned. I mean, I would say the competition is really with artificial sweeteners or sweeteners that are highly processed. So I think the maple industry, yes, you could look at it as competition, but really we're all producing this really unique food, and people should consider swapping out corn syrup for maple syrup whenever they can. But I mean, we have good friends in Wisconsin and Michigan, but I'll say that, Franklin County, Lamoille County, they each produce more than the state of Wisconsin. And if Franklin County was a state, it would be the second largest producer in the country. So they are growing, those other states, but they
got a ways to catch up.
They got a ways to go.
Yeah.
But I don't want to think about it in terms of
Sure.
competition like that, where there's a lot of sharing of information, and maple is such a unique product, and it's really important to just focus on on getting consumers to understand the difference between that and some really highly processed sweeteners.
All right, we were talking about this briefly before the show, but we also get some information out of Canada, is that right?
We do, yep. Obviously, Quebec is the largest producer in the world. They produce, just the province produces over 70% of all the syrup in the world. Statistics Canada is sort of the equivalent of USDA within Canada, and they publish reports on the production within the provinces in Canada. Quebec had a great year for sure. The Quebec system is a little different too because it's really highly regulated. They all sell syrup into one central agency, so it is a little different, but they had a great year. There's a lot of syrup in inventory now, and consumers all over the world are going to benefit from that.
And we talk a lot about technique and technology when it comes to maple syrup production. Is that even really a factor?
Yes, absolutely. So doing the basics right of having, if you're using a tubing system, making sure it's tight, straight, and downhill, making sure you're actively out there making repairs when the leaks occur, because they do occur. All those things are important in production. What can swamp a lot of that is the weather. If you have abnormally high temperatures during the season, that can play a big role. And then anything you can do to foster healthy trees throughout the year is really important. So careful active management and anticipating some of natural disturbances that we're seeing more and more, and doing work to try to mitigate that as best possible, or at least be resilient to it, is going to be extremely important.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
And that takes care of our program for today. My thanks to the crew behind the scenes here at WCAX. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have a good one.